Let's get started. So welcome everyone to the second webinar in our webinar series on rapid response and rapid systematic reviews for international development. This is a webinar that's co-organized by 3IE and the Africa Centre for Evidence. Before we get started, just a couple of practical information points. So there is a Q&A function which you can use at any point during the webinar to add any questions that you have. And then we'll stop along the way to address the questions that appear there. And then there is also a chat function, but that is reserved for any technical issues that you might be having. If you for any reason drop out of the webinar, just wait for a minute and try to rejoin. And then before we get started, we would like to do a poll to get a sense of who it is that we're talking to. So if I can ask Thomas, if you can please start the poll. So we have some questions that are related to where you're based and your experience with systematic reviews. As well as if you attended the previous webinar. So I can't actually see the poll. And Lawrence, can you see it? Anyone?
Yeah, I think it came through on my side. Yeah.
Okay. So can you tell us what the poll is showing?
Yeah. So we have the results. So 16% of respondents did the practical exercise, which I think is quite exciting. Unfortunately, there were also the fifth roughly who couldn't do the exercise due to technical difficulties, and apologies for those. Very understandably, there's also quite a few people, 60%, who just didn't have the time to do the exercise, which we fully understand. I think everybody's plates are quite full with work. And a small percentage, only 5%, who found the exercise too difficult and therefore didn't manage to engage in it. And yeah, that's it.
Great. Thanks, Lawrence. So we will have some time towards the end where we will talk a bit more about both the technical issues, which we did suspect that there might have been one because of some feedback that we had, but also to give people an opportunity to ask any questions. So there will be time for that later on. So let's get started. So Lawrence, can you confirm that you can see my screen?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, it shows nicely.
Yes. Okay. Right. So my name is Bertha Sneelstveit. I'm a senior manager for synthesis and reviews and head of the 3IE London office. And my co-conveners of this webinar series, and which is preparing us for a workshop at the What Works Global Summit in Mexico, is Laurent Langer, who's a senior researcher at the Africa Centre for Evidence, and Jennifer Stevenson, who is an evaluation manager at the Education Endowment Foundation. So just a brief outline of the plan for this webinar. So we've got 2 hours, and I will start because our sense is that there might be some people attending who didn't attend last week. So I'll just recap a little bit about the aims and objectives of this exercise. And then I'll talk a bit about the scope of this, the rapid systematic review that we're doing, and focusing on some key parts of the protocol, because we didn't really talk much about that last week at all. And then Jennifer is going to go through a introduction to risk of bias in studies for inclusion of systematic reviews. And so first kind of giving an overview of what it is and how to do it, and then to do a practical exercise where Jen will take us through doing the risk of bias. And then if we have time at the end, I will talk a bit about some issues that are common in study management, using this our review as an example, and this will also be a chance for any of you to raise issues that you've had in the first practical. Right, so just very briefly about the motivation for this webinar series and workshop. So all three of us have worked on systematic reviews in international development for a long time, and we've seen two key long-standing challenges. The one is the need to provide timely or rapid responses to demands for evidence to inform decisions. So that means that often we get requests for evidence where really the client would like to have a synthesis within a couple of months. And that is something that can be done, but you need to have a big and highly experienced team. And then there is another challenge, which is building capacity to produce systematic reviews in international development, and especially among researchers in low and middle income countries. But I think that we've seen that even whilst for impact evaluations, typically we see that there is more supply of researchers that have the skills to do impact evaluations than actually there is demand. We find in our own experience that it's often difficult to identify people who have the skills to do this. And we also know that to be able to develop the skills, you need an opportunity to apply the skills in practice. But in the context of synthesis that needs to be conducted very quickly, that's often quite challenging. So really, this exercise that we're doing now is to try and sort of address both of these challenges, or see if we can address both of those challenges. And one of the ways that we want to try and do that is to draw on the idea of citizen science. So citizen science is to have citizens or volunteers involved in conducting research, and probably the best example of that at the moment, and where we are taking some of our inspiration from, is the Cochrane collaboration, which some of you might know. Cochrane is producing systematic reviews focused on health topics. But they have this, the Cochrane crowd, where they've used the crowd and crowdsourcing to screen the literature and classify studies into whether they are a randomized controlled trial or not. So, so really what we're trying to do, and this kind of the aspect of the webinar and the practicals, the idea is that you are part of the crowd, you are a citizen science, but the idea is that at the same time, you should also be developing some skills, which means that you're better placed to work on conducting a systematic review independently. And so what we thought that we would do for this exercise is to start with an existing evidence gap map, and to use that as a starting point to conduct a rapid synthesis and a rapid response to a real evidence request. So for those of you who joined last time, you will know that we have partnered with Synergia from Colombia, the Colombian government, where they have identified a need for evidence on the effect of cash transfer programs on intimate partner islands. And so we're using, the idea is that together we will be responding to this request for evidence by starting from an existing evidence gap map. So this is a experimental exercise for us. We've never done this before, but we want to test it out and see if it's also something that we can build on and continue doing more of in the future. So specifically, our objective is to demonstrate or test the processes and methods for using an evidence gap map as a source for a rapid systematic review. Another objective is to build the capacity of all of the participants in our webinars to perform key synthesis tasks. And so we've focused on data extraction, and today we'll do risk of bias, and next week we will do effect size calculation and meta-analysis. And also finally, part of what we want to assess is the feasibility of this idea of citizen science in international development. So last time we sort of jumped straight into, so we had our policy counterpart give the background and the brief around the evidence request, and then we moved straight into talking about data extraction and then doing a practical walkthrough of that. So today, before we start, I just want to say a couple of words about the protocol. So what the protocol, a study protocol is, and some things to think about, and specifically the protocol for this project. So typically when we develop the scope for a systematic review, there are a couple of key things to consider. So one key part, and I'd say probably the most important part, is to make sure that there is a good fit between the scope of your systematic review and the policy question, or in this case the evidence request that you are responding to. That doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be narrowly only cover the specific intervention and outcome of interest, but you need to think about framing it in a way that doesn't take you too far away from the main policy interest. And in doing that, it's also useful to consider your pre-existing knowledge of the evidence base. So if you know that you're working in an area where there is a fairly limited evidence base, then that might be a consideration, which means that you want to think about making your scope slightly broader, so that you make sure that you have that there might be some evidence available to synthesize. And so really, the study protocol lays out the scope of your systematic review. So it's clearly outlining exactly what is included in the systematic review. So here we're using the analogy of the protocol being like the recipe for your study. So it outlines the ingredients, it outlines the methods for preparing the ingredients, for adding them to the review, and then finally how to combine them. And so that means that you lay out clearly your inclusion criteria for studies that you will include in the review, and then what you will take from that study, so the methods for extracting data, what you will do if you have missing data, how you will calculate effect sizes, and then how to combine them, so the methods that you will use for your meta-analysis, the methods that you will use if you can't do a meta-analysis, etc. And so just to note that typically a systematic review protocol is prepared before you start the systematic review, and it's often peer reviewed through organizations like Cochrane or the Campbell collaboration, and then the protocol is published, so that it's clear that actually, and it's transparent, these are the studies that we are including, these are the methods for how we're going to handle them and combine them, so that your audience know that when you publish your review, you haven't picked studies or combined them in ways that are driven by results or your knowledge of the included studies. So those of you that were able to access the link to the Dropbox, there is a protocol document there, which is outlining, so that document is focusing on the so identifying studies and the criteria for study inclusion. And then we're working on the final part of the document, which is more detailed about the statistical methods. And that should be there over the next couple of days. Okay, so just very briefly, what is it that we are reviewing? So we're doing a rapid systematic review on the effect of cash transfers on intimate partner violence. And specifically, we will include, so we're using, and some of you might be familiar with the PCOS acronym. So PCOS is a framework for helping us to specify the key characteristics of studies we look at when we decide whether they should be included or not. And so the P stands for the population. So in our case, we are limiting inclusion to studies from low and middle income countries. And we are not excluding any population groups within that, as long as it's the studies conducted in a low and middle income country, and regardless of whether it's reporting results on for men and women separately or together, we include the study. And then in terms of the interventions, so we're including cash transfer programs, either as a one-off grant or provided at regular intervals, with or without conditions. And you'll see in the protocol document, which has a bit more detail, that we will also allow the inclusion of studies that might have additional components like a training program or cognitive behavioral therapy, etc. And then there is the comparison group. So we allow studies that compare an intervention group to either what is often called business as usual, so no specific intervention, or studies which is comparing two different interventions against each other. And then for outcomes, so we have separated the outcomes into primary and secondary outcomes. So the primary outcomes are those that are directly related to intimate partner violence. So we know that IPV is measured in a number of different ways. So as you'll see from the protocol, it's a fairly inclusive in terms of the ways in which IPV is measured, whether that is through a kind of index measure or whether it's more disaggregated measures of emotional violence, physical violence, sexual violence, and also people's attitudes relating to IPV. But to be included, the study needs to report on one of the primary outcomes, so a direct measure of IPV, whatever that is. But then for studies that meet that criteria, we also are interested, because we're interested in knowing not just if cash transfer programs affect IPV, but if they do so, what the mechanism or causal pathway is. So we're also then interested in knowing effects on outcomes that have been theoretically or empirically suggested to influence IPV. So things like women's empowerment, women's physical and mental health outcomes, etc. And then finally, for study design, again, there is more detail in the protocol, but we're focusing on experimental and quasi-experimental study designs. And so just very briefly about how we identified the studies for inclusion. So as I mentioned, we started with an existing, just recently published evidence gap map on intimate partner violence. And there is a link in the slide if you want to have a look at that. And within that evidence gap map, there is a intervention category, which is economic and income generation interventions. So we screened through all the studies that were captured within that category and identified any studies of cash transfer programs. And so that meant that we excluded things like microfinance or group-based savings and livelihoods groups, which were within this broader category in the evidence gap map. And so we then ended up with 14 papers that met the inclusion criteria, which have then been allocated for data extraction. And so that was the basis of the first practical. And we can talk a bit more about those papers later on. Just a note that, so normally when we do a systematic review, we would conduct an exhaustive and systematic search. In this case, we're also interested in testing the idea of starting from an evidence gap map, which also includes a systematic and exhaustive search, but to see to what extent we can use that as a basis for rapid systematic reviews. Right, so then I think it's so that was just kind of to give you all a sense of the scope of the review before we move over to risk of bias. But maybe if there are any questions about the scope and the inclusion criteria, we can take those now.
Hello, Bertie. Just to say, we currently don't have questions in the Q&A.
Okay, great. So over to you, Jen.
Thank you, Berta. Let me just get my slides up and share my screen. Okay, would someone be able to confirm that they can see my slides?
Yeah, sound looks super.
Great, thanks, Lawrence. Right, everyone, thank you all for joining again today. Please excuse my voice, I'm recovering from a cold, so I'm slightly croaky. But my name is Jen Stevenson. As Berta said, I'm an evaluation manager at the Education Endowment Foundation, but I used to work at 3IE with Berta on synthesis. And so I've undertaken a number of risk of bias assessments for a number of different reviews in different areas. And just to say before I get started, that has been enormously valuable for the work I do now, which is mainly working in primary research. It's really given me a good overview of what to look out for when designing a primary study that aims to understand causal inference. So today, yeah, I'm going to be talking about risk of bias assessments. This is an overview of what I hope you'll get from this session. So hopefully you will come away with this understanding why we assess risk of bias in systematic reviews, understand the concept of risk of bias and what is not covered by this assessment. I hope you will understand the main domains of bias and the tools available to make assessments, and be familiar with some of the ways it can be used in the analysis of results. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the theoretical element of it. And then, as Berta said, I am going to walk you through an example for one of the studies that's been included in this rapid synthesis. So first of all, why do we assess risk of bias in systematic reviews? So ultimately, we want users to be able to use the findings of the synthesis to inform decision making. And to do that, we need really to be able to say to what extent we believe the research that has been done to date. And that depends in part on the validity of the studies that are included within the systematic review. So here we're talking about systematic reviews of intervention effectiveness. So for each study that we include, we are going to try and extract at least one set of results for calculation of an effect size, which I'll talk about next week. And there's a range of different study designs that attempt to quantify treatment effects. This might be randomized control trial, but there's also a range of quasi-experimental approaches such as difference in difference, interrupted time series, regression discontinuity designs, and systematic reviews in social and economic interventions in LMICs like this one frequently include both randomized control trials and quasi-experimental designs. But these designs, some are subject to higher risk of bias than others relating to their design and analysis method. And randomized control trials, for example, are thought generally to be at lower risk of bias than quasi-experimental designs. But taking all of this together, I think it's important that we assess whether or not we trust the results of the included studies that are underlying the results of a systematic review. Just taking a step back, what do we actually mean by risk of bias? So bias are factors that can systematically affect the results of a study and cause them to be different from the truth. And we always talk about risk of bias because when we're doing these assessments, we will never know with certainty if the result is biased. Ultimately, we're trying to estimate a treatment effect that we don't actually really know. So the way that we assess the risk of bias is to look for methods that have been shown to minimize the risk of bias. So taking that all together, risk of bias is an assessment of the likelihood that features of the study design or the conduct of the study and the analysis will give biased results. And this might be either overestimating or underestimating the results of a study. So before I start talking about kind of the tools and what the different domains of risk of bias are, I think it's important to say a few things which are not included in risk of bias assessments. So the first one is imprecision or precision. Imprecision comes into a study due to random error that comes from sampling variation, which is usually reflected in the confidence intervals around your estimate of treatment effect. The tool doesn't really assess whether or not these confidence intervals are accurate. I think quality is often kind of used interchangeably with risk of bias, that term, but really kind of is a more general term to describe whether or not a study was done to in the best way that it could be. So it's possible to have a kind of well-conducted study that has bias, and not all method flaws introduce bias. For example, there may be flaws relating to the ethical conduct of the study that don't actually result in biased estimates of the treatment effect. Relatedly, reporting, it's possible that good methods may have been used, but they're not actually reported in your study, which does make doing a risk of bias assessment more difficult. But we don't kind of rate studies down a lot by whether or not they didn't report. That's not kind of a component of risk of bias as such. And the final point is the external validity of the study. So risk of bias is mainly concerned with the internal validity of the study. Do we trust this effect estimate? It doesn't really concern itself with external validity, which is more about, do the findings apply beyond this setting? It's just really about kind of who was in your sample for the study, and does it really look like the rest of the sample that you're applying it to? And we will talk more about generalizability and external validity, I think, when we have the workshop in Mexico. So that being said, the first step, if you want to take a risk of bias assessment for your review, is to choose a tool. So the range of different tools available, I'm going to talk about them in the next slide. You will then need to describe that tool in your protocol, which obviously Berta has just talked a little bit about. And there's a number of questions that you need to consider when you're thinking about taking a risk of bias assessment. So the first one is, will you undertake the risk of bias assessment at the study or the outcome level? So as you'll see when I start talking about kind of the areas of bias that you might come across in a study, some of those will be the same across outcomes in the study, but some will be outcome specific. So really, it's probably best practice for you to be doing your risk of bias assessment at the outcome level within a study. So if a study reports 3 different outcomes, then you do a risk of bias assessment on each of those outcomes. That being said, that's obviously quite labor intensive, and so not all study authors do that, and that's something to consider. The next point to consider is, will you have more than one reviewer assessing risk of bias? I think Cochrane and Campbell collaboration methods guidelines around this typically recommend that 2 independent people assess risk of bias and then make a comparison to kind of reduce human error and bias. But again, obviously that's very resource intensive. And so some people tend to just have one person doing the assessments and have someone else checking the results, or doing a double review for just a sample of the studies included in your review. You need to consider, if you are doing having 2 reviewers assessing risk of bias, how will you resolve disagreements between the 2 reviewers, or you have to get another reviewer involved to help you resolve your disagreement. There are specific areas of bias, domains of bias, that might be more important for your particular intervention. I think maybe that will become a bit clearer later. So you should probably think about that up front. Are there any areas for this particular intervention that you think might cause studies in this area to be at higher risk of bias? And finally, you need to think about how you're going to use the results of your risk of bias assessment in your analysis and the review, and that's something else I'm going to talk about a bit later. So once you've thought about all of those things, you are probably ready to undertake your risk of bias assessment for each study included in your review. So going back to what risk of bias tools are available. So these tools typically are broken down into tools for randomized controlled trials and non-randomized studies. Some of the tools allow you to assess bias in both, whereas some are specific to the specific design. So the risk of bias tool 2, that tool is specific just to randomized controlled trials. And the Cochrane's Robin I tool was developed specifically to assess risk of bias in non-randomized studies. The 3IE risk of bias tool allows you to assess bias in both RCTs and non-randomized studies. And the EPOC tool is specific just to RCTs. This is far from a comprehensive list of different risk of bias tools. These are just some of the common ones that are used, or that I've definitely seen in systematic reviews and international development. But there are a lot of different tools out there, and they do overlap a lot. But some are specific to design or specific to the particular sector. So, I mean, many of these have been developed in health. They have kind of questions that are more specific to health interventions. So before I dig into what the domains of bias are, does anyone have any questions? Are there any questions, Lawrence?
No, I think it's all clear, at least in the Q&A. There's nothing currently.
Okay, cool. There will be other opportunities. I'll stop a few other opportunities to ask questions. Right, so risk of bias tools, they are usually organized around particular domains of bias. So I've got quite a lot of different pictures there that may seem bizarre at the moment. Hopefully by the end you'll be able to come back and look at this and kind of figure out what these pictures are. And these are the domains of bias that I'm going to talk about are kind of some of the most common ones that you see across tools. They may not, I'm not sure that they're comprehensive, but they are the most common. So within a risk of bias tool, they typically provide a series of signaling questions for you. So when you're reading a study, they enable you to kind of evaluate the likelihood of bias within that specific domain. And once you've answered those signaling questions, they typically then give you some decision criteria to allow you to come to some kind of assessment of the risk of bias in that area. So different tools do this slightly differently. But most of them will end up with a sort of qualitative statement about the risk of bias in that particular area, which might be kind of low risk of bias, moderate, high, or critical risk of bias. Some say some concerns, serious concerns. It really depends on the tool. And most of the domains of risk of bias are common to both randomized controlled trials and non-randomized studies. But the signaling questions within each domain are typically, or they should be, specific to the design that you're looking at, because there will be specific types of bias that you might expect to see within certain designs. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is confounding and group equivalence. So confounding refers to the extent to which causality can be attributed to factors determining outcomes other than the interventions. So when we talk about confounding factors, they're usually related. It's a factor that's related to receipt of the intervention and to the outcome. It's kind of a third factor that's influencing both and may make it seem like there's a relationship between the intervention and the outcome when really it's the result of this confounding factor. But to give you an example from education, a typical confounder is kind of pupil or a school's motivation. So it could be that a pupil who is more motivated may be more likely to seek out support or seek out an intervention. But because of that higher motivation, they may be more likely also maybe to work harder for a test, for example, and therefore get a higher test score. So when it comes to looking at the results for pupils who are in the intervention and looking at the outcome, it may seem like those pupils are doing better than pupils who aren't in the intervention, but actually it's a result of this third confounding factor. It's not as a result of the intervention. So this confounding can kind of be addressed by design or analysis. So randomized control trials, one of the great things about them is that an expectation they lead to intervention and comparison groups with the same characteristics, both observable and unobservable characteristics, which means that when you can compare the results, compare the outcomes at the end of whatever your trial is testing, whatever your intervention is, the only difference between your intervention and control group should be as a result of your intervention. They should be free from confounding factors. For non-randomized studies that don't randomize their participants into treatment and control group, it can be it's much harder for them to make a convincing case for how they have overcome confounding. But there are a range of tools, there are a range of designs and analysis methods that do attempt to do this. I'm not really going into detail on those today, but I'm happy to share some literature on those. So the second point, or the second domain of bias, that I'm calling sample selection bias, non-random attrition. So this really comes in once an intervention has started, and it results from participants that started out the study. They might have been randomized into treatment and control, but at some point during the study, they are excluded from data collection or analysis. And there's something about the way that they were excluded, which means that that it is related to the outcomes. There's something kind of non-random about it, which means that they're no longer, your two groups are really no longer comparable. So the related domain to this, really overlapping, is kind of bias due to missing data. So when you have missing outcome data or kind of missing covariate data for someone in your intervention or comparison group. And what you really need to think about when you're thinking about, is there bias from my missing data, is the data that's missing from my data set, is it representative of the measured data, or is it systematically different in some way from the data that's still in there? I.e., is it missing not at random, or is it missing at random? So the third domain of bias is bias due to departures from intended interventions. So this covers things like crossovers. So this is when individuals within a trial, for example, cross over into a different group than the one they were assigned. So, for example, if a pupil was randomized to be in the treatment group, the intervention group, for some reason they might have been put accidentally in the comparison group, or the other way around. Spillover effects are also something that can occur in a trial that can give you biased results. So this typically occurs when there is some kind of contact between people in your intervention group and people in your comparison group. So to give you an example to try hopefully make that a bit clearer, you imagine that within a school you randomize one class into an intervention, say a teacher training intervention, and you randomize another class into the comparison group. And the class in the intervention group, the teacher goes and gets their training, they deliver it in their class, but then they also talk to the comparison group teacher about what they've been doing or what they've been implementing. And then the comparison group teacher goes and starts implementing. And so you lose that kind of comparison between having a treatment group that has the intervention and a control group that doesn't have the intervention. So one way to overcome this is to kind of have some kind of geographical separation between your intervention and comparison group, as you have in that image there. But it can be an issue if you don't think about it within trials. So the next one is bias in measurement of outcomes. So this is a really big group of potential biases, and can be potentially problematic in all studies. This covers things like recall bias. So if there's some kind of systematic difference between your intervention and control group's ability to remember something, and they're asked it in a survey. It might cover survey effects, whereby when groups are kind of asked something over and over again, they're more like kind of sensitized to that information. It also covers things like experimental effects or performance biases, which refers to when participants in a study might modify their behavior or responses because they're aware of being in the study and they're aware of being in a particular, either the intervention or the comparison group. So in health, they typically recommend that the participants in a trial are blinded to their allocation. This typically is not possible in the kind of interventions that we might be interested in. It's called social and economic interventions. It's very hard to not tell someone whether or not they're getting a cash transfer. But it is possible to blind outcome assessors to the intervention or control group status of the people in the trial, because you might think that some bias also may occur from someone who's assessing outcomes, for example, doing an interview or conducting a study, from knowing that that person they're talking to has received some intervention for the last year. And so the final domain that I'm going to talk about is bias in selection of the reported result. So this corresponds to selective reporting of, it could be outcomes, it could be results from subgroups of participants, or selective reporting of a certain method of analysis. So, you know, some people know this as cherry picking, hence the cherry picture, or kind of p-hacking. I mean, this type of bias is probably more likely in quasi-experimental studies, which tend not to be pre-registered. So the presence of a kind of a study protocol or a pre-analysis plan can help overcome this bias in just mining your data to find a positive effect, essentially. Although even now, many randomized studies still don't have pre-analysis plans or a study protocol. But when you're doing your risk of bias assessment, it's something to look out for, is whether or not the study has been registered. And I've got a few examples of registries that exist to register randomized controlled trials in international development there. So I think before I talk a little bit more about the specific tool, I don't think there's any questions, but Lawrence, have I missed any?
Yes, there's one really good question actually from Chelsea Robenheimer. And the question is, if we're sourcing these studies from peer-reviewed journals or other trusted publications or universities, how worried should we be about these type of biases? So if you could maybe reflect on that for a second.
Yes, that's a very good question. I think these kind of biases can come up in any kind of study, whether it's and this is from experience, but also what the literature says, in journal articles and kind of grey literature reports that might come from just organisations that never made it into a journal article. Partially because it's kind of impossible to control by design all of these possible areas of bias. For example, dropout. You can't always protect against people dropping out of your studies. That could happen in a very perfectly well-designed study, even that makes it into a journal article. And therefore, just because something has been published in a journal doesn't mean that it's not subject to certain biases. Is there any more?
Super, thank you. Yeah, actually, one more just popped in the Q&A. It's from Moses Onavi. And the question is, what is your thought about publication bias?
Okay, yeah, good question. So typically we do assess publication bias within a systematic review, but we do it at the review level. So publication bias occurs really because studies with a positive or a statistically significant finding are more likely to be published. And so once we've identified all of the studies within the review, when we've kind of extracted all of the data from the review, when we've looked at the effects, there are certain methods that we can do to assess whether or not we think there is bias in there is publication bias in that particular literature. But that's typically done at the review level. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit more next week when we talk about analysis.
Thank you. And one more came in. My apologies. So this one is from DNA Economics, and the question is, what do you do when you find a high risk of bias? Is the article excluded from the evidence map?
Good question. And you have anticipated very well the next part of my presentation. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can do with your results, because I think this is different groups have different approaches to inclusion of studies with high or critical risk of bias within their reviews. But I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, so I'll leave that one.
Super, thank you. Yeah, I think that's all.
Great. Okay, so now I'm going to, what you have up on the screen at the moment is an example of a risk of bias question from a risk of bias tool that was used in a recent systematic review that I was involved with, which was led by Hugh Waddington. It was systematic review. It's been published in the Campbell Library about governance interventions in low and middle income countries. And this is the tool specifically for randomized controlled trials, and it really draws on the 3IE risk of bias tool and the Cochrane risk of bias tool. So I wanted to put this here just to give you a kind of example of what the questions look like. So this one relates to confounding and group equivalence. So it asks, were the methods of analysis executed adequately to ensure comparability of groups throughout the study and prevent confounding? So that's kind of a high level question. And then below that, you've got a series of signaling questions. So these are the questions that you need to go through and ask of your study in order to be able to answer this higher question. So in this case, it's were the baseline characteristics similar in magnitude? If there were any unbalanced covariates at baseline, at the individual and cluster level, are they controlled for an adjusted analysis? And were any adjustments to the randomization taken into account in the analysis? So you need to go through your study, kind of think about these 3 questions, and then you have 5 possible answers to each one of these. Yes, probably no, no, or unclear. Unclear is typically when the information is just not reported, or we're really, based on the information that is available, we're really not sure about the answer. Yes and no are quite definitive. Typically, probably yes and probably no indicates an element of judgment in the decision rather than having really very clear evidence. But what you also have are a series of decision rules for each of these signaling questions, which you'll see when I go through the example, that help you come to this overall assessment of either yes, probably no, etc. And then you can use these answers to come to a kind of that qualitative statement that I mentioned earlier about high or moderate or low risk of bias. So in terms of coming to, once you've done your risk of bias assessment for all the outcomes and all the studies in your review, it's typical to display them in a graph like this. So this is done at the review level, and then for each of the domains in your risk of bias assessment, you present the proportion of studies that answer yes, probably yes, unclear, to kind of get a broad overview of the risk of bias of the body of evidence that you're reviewing. And it's also typical to present the results by individual study as well. So for each individual study and each outcome within that study, how that study performed for each of the different risk of bias domains. And so this comes on to the question about what to kind of do with your risk of bias assessments once you've done them. Just to say, I think the question asked specifically about evidence maps. I think in evidence maps, they typically don't do a risk of bias assessment because their goal is just to kind of map the evidence. And it's more typical to do a risk of bias assessment within a project like this where we're doing some synthesis as well. So it's best practice to kind of first start by just giving a narrative description alongside your graph of the risk of bias of the evidence base that you've found. One option is to conduct sensitivity analysis to consider the potential impact of studies at high risk of bias on your overall conclusions. So that might mean kind of taking out those high risk of bias studies and comparing the results when you just look at the low risk of bias studies. I think one important thing to remember is that it is also possible that effect sizes that come from non-randomized studies differ in some way to RCTs, not just because of bias, but also because they're different in some other way, which may be differences in the population that they're looking at or the type of treatment estimate. So just to say, if you do find a difference in results between your non-randomized studies and RCTs, be kind of tentative about that. You know, it may be due to bias, or it may also be from other issues. Some synthesis will exclude studies that they are high or critical risk of bias from evidence synthesis. In general, I think you're generally advised to be kind of quite cautious with doing this and provide a very clear rationale and criteria for how you would exclude studies. and ensure that this is pre-specified in your protocol to avoid introducing bias through some kind of post hoc decisions based on the study findings rather than bias. And the two last points are really related. So some reviewers will kind of, for each outcome within their systematic review, they may have 5, 10, 15 studies that they found, and they may use the results of the risk of bias for those studies to come to some conclusion about the risk of bias for that particular result. So not just for the kind of risk of bias for the individual study, but also for the high level result. And this is typically done using some pre-specified criteria. It might just focus on specific risk of bias items. And then sometimes people go another step and use the conclusions to form a kind of a broader assessment of their certainty in the evidence base. So really, I'm really talking about grade assessments here, which are kind of grading your certainty in the evidence base, which takes in consideration risk of bias, but also other things like the applicability of the evidence to a certain research question, the precision, and issues like publication bias. So there are problems with existing risk of bias tools that are commonly noted in the literature. So most are not really well suited to the full range of quasi-experimental designs that there are available. You typically find that they may cover some quasi-experimental designs, but not all, and perhaps the signaling questions are not fully adapted for that particular design. That can be a challenge when you do, within your systematic review, you include a wide range of different designs. They can be quite complicated, they can be quite hard to use. I'm not going to name any particular names, they all generally are. It is quite a technical thing to do, and sometimes it could be decision criteria are not always very clear, and you do have to use some subjective judgment in there. And the final point is that it's often very difficult to make a judgment about which direction you think the bias is acting in. So whether it's, you know, overestimating or underestimating your effect. And risk of bias will generally stay fairly quiet on helping you to make this decision. So you may be able to say fairly confident you think that this study has a high risk of bias, but you're not. It's often much harder to say whether you think it's overestimating or underestimating the results of your study. So that was everything I wanted to say about the sort of theoretical side of it before I get into running through one with all of you all together. Yeah, that was definitely a very whistle-stop tour, and there is a lot of literature out there that you can go away and read. And as I said, I'm very happy to share some of that with you after. Lawrence, are there any more questions before I move on?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Jen. There's one more question. Asking, it's brilliant. What to do with the risk of bias in different aspects is also decided beforehand or after the risk of bias display is made. So I think it's about, like, do you make the decisions on what to do with the risk of bias before you start your study, or is it something you kind of decide while you go along or once you have the results in? Yeah,
that's a good question. So you best practice would be to design or decide on the tool that you're going to use and your approach to undertaking the risk of bias before you even start searching for studies. So you kind of design the process beforehand, because you want to avoid kind of tailoring your risk of bias tool based on the results of the studies that you identify. I hope that answers the question.
Super, thank you. And we just got two more. The next one is about other risk of bias tool. What your opinion is about their limitations?
Yes, so I think other. So do you mean, I hope maybe they mean other tools that I'm, apart from the one that I'm about to present.
Yeah, I would assume so. Yeah.
Let me have a look. I mean, I think the limitation of all of these tools in a way is the one that I mentioned before about not covering the kind of full range of non-randomized studies. And so the reason that I'm using this one today is because we tried to, my team that I was working with tried to adapt the tool to kind of cover the different designs that we were including within one tool. But these generally don't cover all the different designs you have. I think some of the issues with the health risk of bias tools is that they really don't, they may not be well suited to the kind of other kinds of more social and economic intervention. I mentioned the issue with blinding your participants to what treatment group you're in. I mean, that's obviously pretty much impossible when you're doing an intervention like cash transfers, and so they usually require some adaptation. And I'm not aware of kind of one tool that kind of adequately does this. Yeah.
Super, thank you. And then the last question is how you would explain the risk of bias to a policymaker, in particular when presenting an evidence map. Could it undermine the credibility of your study?
Ooh, that's a tricky but very good question. I mean, I think it really depends on who your audience is. But I think the way that you can use this, the risk of bias results, is to kind of be a bit more tentative with your conclusions, depending on what the results of your risk of bias is. Ultimately, when you do synthesis, you're always going to be you're working with the existing evidence base. If the existing evidence base is kind of suffers from a high risk of bias, then that's what you're working with, and you should kind of be honest about that with policymakers when you're presenting results. But also it can be a good way of making a case that we should be doing more rigorous studies in one area.
Yeah, I agree.
Do you have anything to add, Lawrence or Berta?
No, I think you answered it brilliantly. I think from our experience, I would completely agree. If you have an evidence base that is not strong, the tricky situation you find yourself in a policy context is that the policymaker will want to make a decision. So she has to decide whether or not the evidence base is strong or weak. So I think in that context, it's important to outline those limitations, but acknowledge that there's something that is going to happen based on this evidence that is available. And if you're transparent about what the inferences are that you can make based on the limited evidence, I think that's perfectly fine. And I like this phrase of the best available evidence. And I think in policy context, we don't have as good and as relevant an evidence base, in particular in kind of the context we work in South Africa, that we would like. So we have to do the best out of what is available. And I think if you're transparent about that I think that's perfectly reasonable and defensible.
Great. Were there any other questions?
Yes, one more just popped in. So it's around sensitivity analysis and whether that's something that you have to use a statistical software package for, or if there are other ways you can analyze the sensitivity for risk of bias assessment.
So the way that you would do the analysis, I guess, really depends on how you've synthesized the study. So if you've done a meta-analysis, one way you could do it would just be to exclude or run separate meta-analyses with some with the full set of studies and some with just the low studies. If you have enough studies, you may be able to run a meta regression, which is kind of equivalent to a meta regression, but where the unit in the study, the observation is the study itself rather than kind of an observation of an individual. Obviously, you would need kind of statistical software. I guess we'll be talking about that a little bit more in the next in the next seminar, but you can use R to do this, which is kind of freely available. If you're doing more of a narrative assessment of the evidence, then obviously you wouldn't need to use kind of statistical tools. It's just something you could talk about narratively. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Those are all questions currently.
Great. So if there are no more questions, then I will go on to the running you through an example. So can you still see what I'm doing, Lawrence?
I can see your slides currently.
Oh, then no. How about now? Can you see a paper?
Afraid we're still seeing your the go-to. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, here we go. Okay.
Yeah, now we can see the paper.
Can I just check if I switch between them? Can you still see that? Can you now see the coding tool?
So we can only see the PDF of the paper in kind of full screen.
I was hoping that I could switch between the two, but perhaps I'll have to have them both up at the same time. Is that how you did it, Lawrence?
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Okay. Right. So I'm gonna run you through a risk of bias assessment for a randomized trial, for one of the papers that's included in our rapid synthesis. Okay. Let me just.
Might be a little bit small in 50%.
Okay, you still can't see the coding tool?
No, I'm afraid not.
Yes. How about now?
Yeah, now we can see it.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry about that. So technical difficulty. Okay. I'm going to be walking you through an example of a risk of bias assessment. So as Lawrence said last week, I may not be doing this completely accurately. The point is more really to demonstrate how you go about doing this process. But if you do spot me missing out any major detail, then please do let me know. So the coding tool that I'm going to be using, as I mentioned, is the one that we developed for, or that my colleagues developed for a review that we recently published in the Campbell Library. So what I'm going to do is I'll go through kind of a few questions, and then if there are any questions, Lawrence, I'll kind of come to you and see if anyone I can answer those questions. So this paper is by Kilburn. It was published in 2018, and it's a randomized controlled trial of a conditional cash transfer that was made to young women, and it was conditional on school attendance. And the article looks at the impact of this program on intimate partner violence in those young women. So the first question that the coding tool asked us is to give a unique study identifier. So I think Lawrence talked a little bit about this last week. So when you're doing coding in a systematic review, you may have a number of different coding documents, one for the descriptive kind of coding, one for the effect sizes, one for the risk of bias. So it's really good practice to give some kind of study identifier to a study, which may also include multiple papers. So I'm just going to call this IPV001. And the study's first author is Kilburn. So as I mentioned, there may be additional papers or sources attached to the same kind of high-level study. There are some for this one, but I'll come back to this one in a little bit. So as I mentioned, we tend to, best practice is really to do the risk of bias assessment on an outcome. Because as I mentioned, one of the specific domains of bias, for example, is bias in outcome measurement, which is very specific to one outcome. You might also have specific attrition for one outcome compared to the other outcomes or missing data. So for this particular study, I'm going to look at just one outcome within the paper and demonstrate the risk of bias assessment for that. So the outcome that I'm going to look at is, we might have a chance to talk about a little bit about this later, but it's also kind of good practice to map out the different outcomes that you have within each paper, so that you can then kind of plan your risk of bias assessment and your effect size calculation. The outcome that I'm going to look at is this outcome, which is any physical intimate partner violence. I'm going to do a risk of bias assessment specifically for this outcome. So the coding tool asked me to put the outcome that I'm looking at here. I'm also going to go and have a look for how this is defined. So I believe the paper has a section on the measures. So here we are, I'm just looking for the definition. So any physical intimate partner violence is an indicator for any experience of physical intimate partner violence in the previous 12 months. I'm just going to take this definition and put it in the coding tool so we know which outcome the risk of bias assessment relates to. Okay, so the next question asks about the design type. So what type of study design is used? So this is, it seems like this is a study that's come from health. It has quite a nice structured abstract. So I'm first just going to look in the method section here and see if it tells me what the design of the study is. So it says here, HPTN was a phase 3 randomized control trial. Okay, so we know here that it's confirmed it's a randomized control trial. And then I'm also interested to know, were individuals randomized into the intervention and control group, or was it kind of a higher level, a cluster? So which might be, for example, a school or a village. So if we read on, it says that eligible young women and their parents or guardians were randomly assigned one-to-one to either receive a monthly cash transfer, etc. So if I can go back to my coding tool, I know that it's a randomized trial, and it's randomized to individual or household. So I'm going to code this as 1. And then ask me to look at which methods are used, which analysis methods are used. So as Lawrence mentioned last week, when you're doing these kind of data extraction exercises, you don't really want to read every single part of the paper. It's probably best to, particularly for the risk of bias assessment, you want to kind of read maybe the abstract to get an overview of the study, but then we're probably most interested in the method section. So we're looking for the analysis method. So I'm going to typically, if a study is well organized like this one, they will have a section on analysis methods. So begin with an intention to treat analysis, total, intervention effects were modeled using generalized estimating equation models. We estimated risk ratios using regressions for binary mediators. Okay. So it says here that they used regression model. And if we read on, it also says that these models control for participants' age at the baseline. So we know that a regression model was used, and they adjusted for at least one covariate as far as we can see. If I go back here, I'm going to look through this list. We know it's a randomized trial, so they didn't do any kind of statistical matching. The one that we want is, or I think that we want, is covariate adjusted estimation. You can see here, they also have the option comparison of means, which in a randomized study may also be a common kind of analysis method. So I then have an option to kind of an open answer to just fill in a little bit more information about this study. So rather than kind of having to go back to the paper, I can just fill in the information here. So I'm going to, I'm going to write individually randomized RPT. I'm going to use this generalized estimating equation model. And I think they said they control for participant page at baseline. So that's really just to kind of back up as well your answer above. The next question is about the unit of analysis. Is the unit of analysis in cluster allocation addressed in the standard error calculation? So this is really asking, this is really relevant when it's a cluster randomized controlled trial. And we know that the treatment was not assigned at the cluster level, so actually this one is not applicable to us. So I'm just going to put a 4 there and a 10A there. And then finally, before I stop, the next question is about the type of comparison group. So is the intervention group being compared to no intervention? Kind of service delivery is normal. Is there another intervention being compared to? Is it a pipeline design? So at the end of the trial, will the comparison group get the intervention that's being offered or some other? So I'm going to go back into the section where they talk about eligibility and randomization and see if they describe what is happening in the comparison group. So there's lots of information here about eligibility for this study. And then here it says, after baseline assessments, young women were individually randomized to either treatment group, monthly cash, conditional on school attendance, or control group, no cash. So it seems like that they were just compared to a group of young women who didn't receive anything. So I am going to put a 1 in this group. Obviously, it could be that they receive it at the end of the trial, but I'm pretty sure in this case I couldn't find any information about that. Right, so before I get into the main, that information was really all kind of descriptive information about the design and analysis method. Does anyone are there any questions, Lawrence, before I get into the main bias assessment?
Thank you, Jen. No, there's no questions at the moment.
Okay, great. So excuse me for 1 minute, I'm just going to grab a drop of water and then go on. Okay. So the first question is asking us about the random allocation mechanism. So was the allocation or identification mechanism random or as good as random? So as I said earlier, you have these you have various categories. Yes, probably yes, probably no, no, and unclear. The next box, we have our criteria, and then we have our decision rules for coming up with just overall assessment of yes, probably yes. So this particular question is really asking about the randomization. Did the randomization take place as it should have done? And does the balance, has it resulted in intervention and control groups that look the same on their observable characteristics at baseline? This first point, criteria A, is asking about, was a random component in sequence generation randomization method reported? I'm going to go and have a look in the randomization section. So actually, while it describes it being a individually randomized trial, it doesn't actually mention how they did this randomization. So I'm not really sure exactly how they went about it. So at the moment, I can't really answer this question because it doesn't actually describe. Part B is not relevant to this one because it's about a public, if a public lottery was used. And C is also doesn't seem to be relevant because it was just a one-to-one randomization. There was no stratification used or other types of randomization methods. So D, however, was a balance table reported suggesting the allocation was random between all groups. Now that I think we do have in this paper. So what you want to look for here is a table that presents the baseline characteristics of your participants in treatment and control. So we have this baseline table here. It presents the characteristics for treatment and control. Ideally, what I'd want to see here is then a comparison of the differences in terms of effect sizes for each characteristic, but we don't have that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look in the text and see if they've described this table, maybe they've done any kind of testing for imbalance. So I can see here it says that all demographic and outcome variables in Table 1 were tested for baseline balance, and we found no significant differences in means between study arms. And in addition, study arms were also balanced on other key behavioural outcomes. So I'm satisfied that the randomization has resulted in balance between the treatment and control groups, so I'm happy with that. They still haven't described exactly how the randomization was done, however. But if you do read the abstract of the paper, you realise that actually there is a linked paper to this one, which seems like it is the main paper for this particular trial. And this one is actually also is included in our synthesis. So I think Berta or Lawrence mentioned this, but it is an important step to make sure at the beginning that you link all related papers, because it's frequently the case that there is one paper that may report more design and analysis or design information than another. So this is the linked paper. I'm going to go and have a look here and see if they report any more information about how the randomization was done. Once again, I'm going to the methods section, and here we have another section on randomization and masking. So it says here that young women and their parent or guardian were randomly assigned 1-to-1 by use of block randomization to receive a monthly cash transfer, conditional on school attendance or cash transfer. Numbered sealed envelopes containing a randomization assignment card were numerically ordered using block randomization. The participant was considered enrolled in the study once the envelope was assigned to a study group. Now, so we've got some more information now about how this was done. They still don't tell us how they generated this random number, but I think this is probably sufficient to believe that they undertook that the study is randomized. So for each one of these risk of bias domains, you need to come up with this overall conclusion. Yes, probably yes, but you also have space to give an open answer to justify your decision. So I'm going to copy and paste this information that we have here. I'm also going to say that there is a balance table, because that addresses the other point. I'm going to put the number of the table so that if you want to go back and look, you can. And then I'm going to say that characteristics balance at baseline. So now let's look back at our decision rule to come up with this, come up with our overall conclusion for this. So I'm only supposed to score yes if all criterion A, B, C, and D are satisfied. Now I mentioned that B and C are not relevant for this particular one. So for A, I'm pretty satisfied that they have although they didn't tell us exactly how they used how they generated the random number, they did tell us how they did the randomization. And the balance table, point D, the balance table has told us that the groups were balanced at baseline. So I'm going to give them a 1 for yes in this particular category. So on to the next one, confounding and group equivalence. Was the method of analysis executed adequately to ensure comparability of groups throughout the study and prevent confounding? So here we have the same set of possible answers, yes, probably no, etc. And then once again, I'm being asked about baseline characteristics, are they similar in magnitude? But really what this is asking about was if there had been any kind of unbalanced characteristics, have I then adjusted for them in my analysis, which would be kind of the best practice. We know that the baseline characteristics were similar in magnitude, and therefore this is not an issue for this particular one. So I'm going to score this one as a 1, as yes. And I'm going to say baseline characteristics similar. They do control for participants' age at baseline, which they don't really tell us why, but they presumably consider this an important covariate for explaining their outcomes. So I'm just going to mention that. Essentially, I'm satisfied that they've that the authors of this particular study have done what they should have. Lawrence, are there any questions at this point?
No, everything seems clear. There's no questions.
Or just so confusing that no one even knows what to ask. Hopefully it's the first one. Okay, so the next question is about differential selection in or out of the study. So I mentioned that one of the domains earlier of bias is kind of attrition or missing data, that it's non-random. So my criteria here, we can score yes if there is no attrition out of the study once the study has begun, or it's less than 10%, and the study establishes that attrition is randomly distributed, and if survey respondents were randomly sampled. So now I need to go back into my paper and have a look for information about attrition. So I'm going to first just do this little cheat and see if it mentions attrition at any point, which it doesn't. So therefore, I'm going to look down and see if it mentions under this table any information about people having dropped out. So just a quick look, I'm not seeing any information here. So what I'm going to try and do, ideally you would have this clearly reported as a separate section in your paper, how many people dropped out at some point during the study from the people that we had at the beginning. So what I'm going to try and do is trying to figure this out myself from the information that they provide. So in this section here, baseline data, we are told that there was a baseline sample of 2,448 HIV negative young women who were included at the baseline in their study. So we know that at the beginning of the study we had 2,448 young women. So I'm just gonna put that there. Now I need to try and figure out, from looking at the results table, if they tell us how many women were followed up with in the trial. So this is the main results table that we're interested in, the intent to treat impacts of the CCT on IPV amongst young women. And this is the particular outcome that we are interested in. So I'm looking and I can see that there's a note at the bottom of the table that says, observations over the 3 follow-up visits out of a total N of 2,302 study participants were followed up for at least 1 visit after the baseline. So what this is telling me is that I think that in this analysis, they have included results for 2,302 study participants. As you can see, you sometimes have to do a little bit of detective work, even in a kind of fairly well reported study, to answer some of these questions. So 200. So from there, I can figure out that, I mean, that's essentially that is a very low rate of attrition. That actually works out as about, I think, about 5% rate of attrition from the baseline to the follow-up. So let's go back to our criteria, our decision rules here. So it says score yes if there is no attrition or it is less than 10%. So we know it's less than 10%. What we don't know is that it's randomly distributed because they haven't really talked about it. But the fact is that because it's so low, I think we probably don't need to be worried about attrition in this particular study. Although ideally, we would be wanting to see a kind of discussion of this in the paper to justify that it's not an issue. But I'm going to score yes here. The next question asks about deviations from intended interventions, spillovers and crossovers. Was the study adequately protected against spillovers and crossovers? So I talked about this a little bit earlier. Is it possible that we think that there may have been, or did the authors report that there were some women who should have been in the treatment group but ended up in the control group, or vice versa? So we can go and have a little look. This kind of information may be reported in various places in a methods report, in a report. It may be in the methods section, so it's worth having a little look in eligibility and randomization to see if they mentioned that there was any kind of crossovers between the intervention and control group, but it doesn't actually mention any here. It doesn't mention it any further down under analysis. Another place that is also worthwhile looking at is the discussion section. Sometimes authors will kind of bury this kind of information in the limitations, which often you'll find in the discussion. So it's often worth having a little look, reading through there. They don't mention any crossovers or spillovers. They also don't mention any risk of contamination by external programs. They don't mention that there may have been any other kind of programs going on at the same time that they think might have affected the outcomes. They don't mention that, so we have to presume that they don't. This particular trial is isolated from other interventions that might explain changes in outcomes. And finally, there is this point about there is nothing in the surveys that might have given the control participants an idea of what the other group might receive. Or they did, but there is no risk that this changed their behaviours. This is really about the control group going and trying to get the intervention because they find out about it from the surveys or some other kind of intervention. And we don't really know, this paper doesn't really talk about this, but given that it's a cash transfer intervention, it's quite unlikely that they would have been able to do that. So I'm going to score probably yes here, because really the authors have not talked about it. But I think it's quite unlikely that there would have been issues in the study. So I'm going to find the authors, write this in the justification box. No reason to asked about performance bias. Was the process of monitoring individuals unlikely to introduce motivation bias among participants? So the answers are yes, and probably no again, as before. And the two criteria for this particular one are the authors state explicitly that the process of monitoring the intervention and outcome is blinded and conducted in the same frequency for treatment and control, or argue convincingly why it's not likely that being monitored could affect the performance of participants, or at least the reporting, because this is, as we know, this is whether self-report data about any physical intimate partner violence. This is self-reported data. So given that I've had a quick kind of look through this paper, but it doesn't really discuss this issue. But I mean, the data is collected in the context of a trial. So obviously these young women, they know that they're being observed. But I think it's quite unlikely that there would be performance motivation issues, particularly as we know that the cash transfers are linked to attendance at school rather than this particular outcome. So there's not really a kind of motivation issue there. So I'm going to go for probably yes again, because once again we don't have information and therefore we can't say for certain. So I'm going to say data. Trial. No reason. Okay. So the last question. No, two more questions. So the next question is on outcome measurement bias. Was the study free from biases in outcome measurement? So once again, we have the same set of possible answers. The criteria that we need to consider here are outcome assessors are blinded, or the outcome measures are not likely to be biased by their judgment. And then for self-report outcomes, which is the case in this particular trial, it asks if respondents in the intervention group are not more likely to have accurate answers due to recall bias. Another one for self-reported outcomes, so this is relevant to us as well. The respondents do not have incentives to over or under report something related to performance or actions, or researchers put in place mechanisms to reduce the risk of reporting biases, or authors have measured the risk of bias through falsification tests. And then finally, there's a question about the timing. So was the data collected at the same time in the intervention and comparison group? So I think we need, this particular one, we need to, given that this is a particularly sensitive outcome, it's self-reported data about the incidence of for young women of intimate partner violence. It's important to have a look and see how the authors collected this information from the young women and whether or not there may have been any kind of biases introduced as part of that process. So we see here that it says that after young women were recruited to the study, participants completed an audio computer-assisted self-interview, CASI. So actually we know that there wasn't, that the participants were not interviewed by a person, they were actually interviewed by some kind of computer program, which actually I think is typically considered more likely to kind of obtain honest answers for the sensitive questions, as in this trial. And then if we go down to the measure section, we see that CASI asks respondents about sexual and physical IPV experiences, regardless of whether they reported having a sexual partner. But if we look further down, they don't really give any other information about how they collected this data. It does seem that they were collected at the same time in treatment and control, although doesn't It says reassess annually at 12, 24 and 36 months. So it seems that they were assessed around the same time. But we don't really have that much more information about this particular question. So the first one about outcome assessors being blinded, that's not actually relevant because they're using a computer program to do interviews to collect this data, so that one's not actually relevant. I don't think probably recall bias is not relevant. That's point B. Recall bias is probably not relevant because the intervention is not related to intimate partner violence. There's no reason why we would think that the intervention group might remember this better. Now, we might think that even though this is in a using a kind of a computer program, so perhaps people might be more willing to be honest about this answer, you still might be a risk of underreporting, given the very sensitive nature of this question. And this is something that's not really discussed in detail within this paper. So in terms of obviously using this computer-assisted program, they've attempted to increase the chance that people feel comfortable to provide the data. So I'm going to give them a probably yes here, because I think there is a small risk related, but it's not kind of discussed in a lot of detail. So here I'm going to, in the justification for my question, self-report data, important to know that there. However, they used computer-based to interview. I'm aware we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm just going to go on to the next question now, which is about analysis reporting. So was the study free from selective analysis reporting? What we really, to be able to answer this question, what we want to know is that there was a pre-analysis plan or trial protocol published before the study was completed that outlined what the outcomes were for this particular study, and give a pre-analysis plan of how they were going to go about analysing this data. I'm going to go back into the paper, and if a trial is registered, it's typically registered. It will typically have it on the front page. So I can see here that it says, indeed, the study is registered at clinicaltrials.gov. So I'm going to take this number. I'm going to have a little look. And here I can see that there is a page where this trial was pre-registered. It was registered first back in 2010, and latest it was updated in 2016, which kind of aligns with the dates we have in the study. What I'm looking here is for the high-level design. I want to see what outcomes they said that they would look at, and potentially what analysis they would do. So we can see here they say that the primary outcome of interest is HIV incidence. We know that was actually reported in a separate study, which we did look at briefly earlier, and that the secondary outcome measures for HSV2 incidence and HSV incidence. So actually we don't have the outcomes here that we are looking at in this particular paper. I'm just going to look a little bit further down to just make sure there's no other information here. So I can't see any more information about other outcomes that they had intended to look at as part of this trial. I'm going to go back here. I can see, for the part A, we can say yes, they were. The trial was pre-registered. However, the outcomes that they were looking at in this particular paper were not actually reported. However, given that they were also assessed at baseline by this CASI tool, we probably can be fairly sure that this, you know, they haven't just collected this outcome data to kind of try and find a positive effect, and they're followed up at 3 different points during the trial. But ideally, we would have wanted to see that those outcomes were reported in that in the pre-registered study. The other things that it's asking for are authors report results of unadjusted analysis and intention to treat estimation. So we can go back to the study. Now, I think we saw earlier that they did do intention to treat impacts. We don't actually have the kind of raw unadjusted analysis in this paper. So I am going to make a note of that in the justification box. So we can say here that the trial was pre-registered, although the data, the outcomes in this paper are not listed on that page. We did not do, they did not present unadjusted analysis alongside ITT. However, that being said, given that we know that there was the groups were very similar at baseline and the attrition was very low, we would not expect that, and that they only adjusted for age in the findings. I don't think that we would expect for adjusted analysis to be radically different from an unadjusted analysis. So I'm just gonna note that there as well. This is a bit of a tricky one, really, because I essentially trust the author that the authors have done what they should have, although I would have liked to see that the outcomes were pre-registered. They do point B, which is report results corresponding to the outcomes announced in the method section in the results section as well. So there's no outcome reporting bias. And although they don't do the unadjusted analysis alongside the intention to treat, I wouldn't really expect to see that. So what I'm going to go for in this particular case is unclear. But I think this is a particularly tricky one because it has been pre-registered, which is much more than many studies in this area do. So there's one final question here, which is about other risks of bias. Is the study free from other sources of bias? This is really a catch-all question, which is trying to, if you do read, when you're reading the study, come across anything else that you think sounds a bit suspicious, you can mention it here. When I was reading this study earlier, generally it's a fairly well-reported study. I'm going to go for just yes here. No, there's no other risk of bias. Identified. So that's the main body of the risk of bias tool. There are also various questions about blinding of participants, which are in the tool. As I mentioned, these are not really, particularly blinding of participants, it's not really relevant to this kind of intervention because it's pretty much impossible, and we actually wouldn't expect or necessarily want participants to be blinded. But they're typically included in a risk of bias tool. So I'm going to say that 2 here, no, participants weren't blinded. It's kind of hard to answer this one about outcome assessors because there were no outcome assessors. It was just a computer self-interview. So I'm going to say not applicable. Now they don't actually mention about the blinding of data analysts in this paper, so I'm going to say that was unclear. And then in terms of the methods used to blind, self-interview for the outcomes. There were no outcome assessors. and participants were not kind. Okay, so that is how one goes about doing a risk bias assessment. I have to say that even though there were some categories that I rated as kind of unclear or probably yes, in general, this is a very well-reported paper and a relatively easy risk of bias assessment to do. I would say in general, it's a bit more complicated to do risk of bias assessments of quasi-experimental designs, because they typically use more slightly more complicated statistical methods, and it may require more theoretical understanding of the intervention itself, for example, around how participants in this particular intervention area typically end up in the intervention group. But I hope this has been useful. Lawrence, before we wrap up, are there any questions? I'm sure there probably are at this point.
Thank you, Jen. This was brilliant. And also thank you to the 30+ participants who stayed with us throughout. There's, I think, two questions. So the first one is really administrative. It's some details like the study unique number lead author went into column D, the decision rule column, and some other responses went into column E. Why is that? And then also, where's the linked paper reflected as a separate entry or import points? Yeah, so I think it's admin question around lead author went into column D and some other responses went into column E, and then how the linked paper that you found is reflected in the sheet.
Okay. Two good questions. The first one about some have gone into the wrong column. That's just purely me getting that wrong. That should all be in the same column. So sorry about that. They should all be in column E. Actually, I think there was just a slight issue with the sheet before I started. The question about the linked paper is a very good one. As I said, we should really be linking these papers before we go about doing our risk of bias assessment. And I think that Bertha has actually done this for this particular one. So when we allocate you this work for the next round, you will see that papers have been grouped together. And so you'll see that there is a row here which is additional papers or sources. So here is where you should be kind of listing the other papers that you've drawn upon to make your risk of bias assessments and your judgment. The unique study identifier, that should be allocated at the study level. So this identifier should be kind of linked to potentially more than one paper. You then have the study author below it to tell you which particular paper was the main paper where the outcome data was reported. Then that additional paper box, that's really telling you where, if you have gone to the other papers within that study, you can record that in that particular box. Yes.
Super, thank you. So there's now two more. So the first one is around, so that in development in several sectors, there are non-financial health, but for example, you don't see too many RCTs. So what is the process, or how is the process different for risk of bias when quasi-experimental design studies are taken? For example, narrative summaries, so would you have a different process for that? And also, would that then mean that the coding sheet itself is different?
Okay, yeah, good question. So for quasi-experimental studies, you would have a slightly different coding tool. It does look very similar to this one. And it will have the same domains of bias. And when I say domains, I mean the kind of questions like, was the method of analysis executed adequately to ensure comparability? Was there any differential selection? However, the questions, the criteria here, and the decision rules might be slightly different to reflect the fact that you're looking at a different type of design. So they would, for example, if you were looking at a regression discontinuity design, there would be criteria here that are specific to regression discontinuity design. And ideally, you'd have a tool that kind of reflected all of the different designs that you've decided to include. And I think, yeah, as I said, I think most Campbell reviews, which are systematic reviews of social and economic interventions, they typically do include both randomized trials and quasi-experimental designs, because we know that there aren't as many RCTs in that area. But there are tools that allow you to do risk advice assessments on quasi-experimental designs.
Brilliant. Super. And I think your pictures were also really nice to understand the different domains of bias. I think we should paste them into the tool for the next time. So then the next question, and I'll merge these two together, is around aggregating the results from the risk of bias. So is there a way of aggregating them to get some sort of bias index? And I think then the link question to that is, so how do you go from the results in the coding tool to the summary chart shown earlier in your presentation? So I think it's around how we go from the individual coding for risk of bias of a study to the overall result for the study itself, and then for the synthesis or the map. Does that make some sense?
Yes. So yes, I didn't have time to kind of go into this, but for most risk advice tools will give you first for each particular domain, it will allow you to go from having this yes or probably yes answer to go for some kind of qualitative statement around low, some concerns, or high risk of bias. Some tools, although this is not all tools do this, will then allow you to make an assessment of the overall study in terms of risk of bias. So kind of a high risk of bias, some concerns, and low risk of bias. Different tools do this in different ways. But some tools might prioritize. They might say that if you have high risk of bias in confounding and group equivalence, and the whole study is at high risk of bias. So they kind of prioritize different areas. Different studies really do this differently. Once you've done that for an individual study, you then you need to obviously do this assessment across every study in your review. And once you've done that, you can get to the where is it gone? Oh, there it is. Once you've done that, once you've made that assessment of every study, you can put it into a graph like this, which tells you the kind of proportion of studies for each of those domains that have a yes, probably yes, unclear, probably no, or no assignment. So I think it's now 4 o'clock. So Berta, I think we need to wrap up right now.
I think we should aim to wrap up pretty quickly. The fact that we haven't been kicked out yet suggests that we won't, but I think let's try to finish in the next 5 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All good. Are there any other questions, Lawrence?
Yeah, I think just one more. So there was a link question of what do you do with all this information, but I think that has been answered. And so just a very quick one, whether then the same person who does the descriptive coding does also do the risk of bias assessment, or whether this is usually a separate process.
Good question. I think that really depends on the skills of your review team. And how you choose to kind of break up the tasks of the review. So it could be that you have a team of people doing just the descriptive coding, and then because the risk of bias assessments does take a little bit more technical knowledge about evaluation design and causal inference, you may have someone who has a slightly different skill set doing the risk of bias assessment. Or if your team, your coders have all of the skills, then maybe they would do both the descriptive and the risk of bias coding, because obviously there are some maybe some efficiency gains from doing it all together, because you become quite familiar with the paper. But I think that really depends on the skills of your team.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I think that's all.
Great, and I think on that note, just a few words about the practicals. So we're going to try again. So thanks to those who were able to do the practical, and apologies to those who tried but were faced with technical difficulties. So we're going to try and do it slightly differently. So we will send a message to all of you who have participated in the webinar with a link to the material and with instructions for what to do if you want to do the practical, so that we actually know who will be doing it, because we are actually working on a live systematic review. So the plan for next week is that we will do effect size calculations and the meta-analysis, and we will provide a systematic review report to our policy client in a couple of weeks. So to make sure that we are actually doing this work, and to also help us in allocating different studies to different people, please respond to the email address provided in the message, letting us know if you are planning to do the practical task, which will include the risk of bias, but also the descriptive data extraction and effect size data extraction covered last time. Right? Okay, so thanks everyone for joining and staying, and I hope to be engaging with you on as you're working on the practicals over the next week, and hope you all will join us in a week's time for effect sizes and meta-analysis. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.